Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Safety Net, Brookline Interactive Group's show dedicated to domestic violence and other issues related to elder abuse, family violence, bullying, sexual harassment. The content of the show is mine and my guests. Adam Sayre is the producer, and with us today we have Susan C. Cohen, General Counsel to the Cambridge Housing Authority. Welcome, Susan. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Susan. I guess we're both Susans who are here today. And I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you.
Well, I think what you do is very, very important considering we're talking about domestic violence. I have to say, I know very, very little about domestic violence in housing authorities. But first, let me say, Susan's been in-house counsel to the Cambridge Housing Authority since 2011. That's a long time to have the same job. Congratulations to you. You must be doing something fabulous over there, and they don't want to let you go. Prior to coming to that, she had her own law practice for 26 years. She specialized in public housing. She was general counsel to Cambridge, Brookline, Watertown, Fitchburg, and Saugus housing authorities, and Bromley Heath Tenant Management Corporation. That must have been really interesting.
Very interesting.
Yes. You participated in development and implementation of the Moving to Work program of the Cambridge Housing Authority, which we'll talk about in a little while. Other representation included advising clients on Uniform Relocation Act, civil rights compliance, on Hope 6th. Is that right?
Hope 6? It is.
Oh my goodness, I have so much ignorance, and other major public housing redevelopments, including projects in Seattle, Pennsylvania, Washington, D.C., Portland, Oregon, California, and Connecticut. Do you have children? Did they go with you?
I have two wonderful children who are both adults, and I have three grandchildren who I am so fond of and lucky to have.
I don't know how you did all of this. You began your career at the Housing Allowance Program in Springfield, Mass. from 1978 to 1980. At this nonprofit housing agency, which administered a wide variety of housing programs, you gained expertise in state and federal housing law and programs in landlord-tenant law. Wow, I'm not even done yet. She subsequently worked at Greater Boston Legal Services from 1980 to 1985, where you handled a broad range of civil litigation with an emphasis on housing law. She's a member of the board and past president of the Housing Development Law Institute, Washington, D.C. Since 2018, she is a commissioner of the Brookline Housing Authority. From 1985 to 1989, she served as public interest member and chairperson of Brookline Rent Control Board. Wow, you're brave. Susan's a graduate of Boston University School of Law, from which she received a JD in 1976, and a graduate of Cornell University. She received a BA degree with distinction in all subjects in 1973. Obviously, you're admitted to the bar of Massachusetts. Welcome, welcome.
Kind of you. Thank you, Susan.
Some time up with us. Holy moly, that's quite a background, Susan. And you're still going.
I'm still going. I'm still working. I'm still committed to the cause. And I'm so delighted to be able to share some of my experience with you today.
Well, I'm thrilled. How did and how does your work in public housing relate to domestic violence, Susan?
Well, the people we serve are low-income people. They can't make more than 80% of area median income, which is really not a lot of money to raise a family in Brookline or the Boston area. And so we have two different kinds of programs that most housing authorities operate, and certainly Cambridge and Brookline are both housing authorities that have a inventory of hard apartment units, developments, and we also run what are called voucher programs, where we pay money to private landlords and tenants can live there at an affordable rent. We make up the difference between their rent and the contract rent. And just like people of all income categories, domestic violence is a problem for many of our residents. But one of the things that distinguishes the population that we serve from other people in the population is they have very few resources. They're already often underhoused, living in not great situations in the first place. When they may suffer from emergency based on being a victim of domestic violence. And then they're going to be looking for housing on an emergency basis. Or they may already be living in public housing or have a voucher in public housing, and they may be experiencing domestic violence in that situation. So what we have to do as housers of low-income people is we need to know how to respond to help people in the best way we can when we find out about their situations. So for instance, somebody's applying for public housing or a voucher in an emergency situation. Under ordinary circumstances, if somebody had been evicted or had a troubled tenancy, they might be rejected from not just public housing, but any kind of housing. But if they're a victim of domestic violence, we have to take that into account. So we have to be able to look at their situation and say, this was not their fault. They are the victim here. They are not the perpetrator. And we want to be able to step up in a way that's meaningful to them. So we see this exhibited both by our applicants and by our residents and our voucher holders.
But how do you, if something comes to your attention, let's say that there's domestic violence within the housing authority, not somebody applying, but they're already a resident.
Mm-hmm.
Who do you work with, and what do you deal with? Do you call the police? Do you have people on staff who are skilled and trained in domestic violence? Do you break it up? Do you how do you work with it?
Well, one of the things that we want to do first is make our staff very cognizant of what are the elements of someone who's a victim of domestic violence. So, for instance, going back to the earlier days when people were less aware of the situation that was experienced by victims of domestic violence, we might get a report that there was damage in someone's apartment, or there was loud noise or disturbance. And without understanding the whole situation, somebody might say, well, you're in breach of your lease and I'm going to evict you. Well, that's the wrong approach, because we need to be looking at why that happened, and we need to be responding to that person. So the very first thing we want to do is train our staff. And we want the staff to understand that they need to be sensitive to a situation where somebody is not in control of the circumstances that lead to what could be otherwise considered a violation of their lease. There's legal protection for the victim, and we need to not only train our staff to recognize domestic violence, but we need to notify our residents of what their rights are under the law. And there's a law called the Violence Against Women's Act.
Yes. Okay, good. Go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, okay. It provides, really broad protections for victims of domestic violence that are part of federal housing programs, which many of our programs are. So for instance, if you're a tenant living in public housing and you have an incident like the one I just described, the VAWA protects you from any kind of action that would be an eviction against you because of something that the perpetrator of the violence committed. So what do you do? Like, we have other tenants.
What do you do? And let's say excuse me for interrupting, and if the perpetrator is, say, the partner or the husband or the son or the whomever, do you say, okay, bye-bye? What do you do?
There's different approaches, and part of it is going to have to be based on what does the victim want us to do, because they're the ones that need to be communicating with us to the extent that they choose to. But there's provisions that we can utilize where we can actually do what's called bifurcating a lease. Usually, if you evict a household, everybody has to go. So if there's a problem with a tenancy, the landlord, be it private, be it public, they would terminate the tenancy, and then the whole family has to go if a judge says that's the right thing to do. But in this situation, there's a special provision that says you could tell the person who is the perpetrator that they must leave. And that would leave the tenant who was the victim and the rest of the household to be in a safe situation. Another thing you can do is you can provide that person with the ability to transfer to a different location. If you have housing that they can move to, that's in a different area that would provide them with safety. And so that's an option that we could investigate with the tenant. And the final option is we could, in some circumstances, issue them the housing voucher that I was describing, where we pay a private landlord the difference between the tenant's affordable rent and the landlord's contract rent. And then they could move much further away, because in some instances, it's not safe just to move across town because the perpetrator may find that person. And so what we want to do is we want to provide the safest solution for the problem for that individual. And that's going to change based on what the victim or the survivor of the domestic violence wants to do. And their preferences have to be paramount there.
Susan, what if you don't agree? What if their preference is to stay with the batterer and they are in serious, serious danger, number one? Number two, where does the money come from for the voucher? And number three, it's my understanding that there's a shortage of housing everywhere for anybody, particularly low income. Where do you find suitable places? I have another question too, suitable places for them to go. And it's also my experience that eviction takes a very long time.
Well, there's a couple of answers to that. One is, it's possible to go into court and get restraining orders against people who are a threat to the health and well-being of residents of public housing. And that's a much quicker process than your long eviction process. The other thing is that while we can't hold the victim accountable for the fact of the damage, and we can't compel them to get services, we can certainly provide them with support. But to the extent that they maintain the situation in a repeated way, we'd have to take that into account in deciding, well, how dangerous is this, not just to the victim, but to anyone else that's on the property.
Exactly.
And so that's going to be a situation that we have to do on a case-by-case basis and work with the resident to figure out what is the best solution. And in terms of the availability of housing, there's kind of different answers to that question. One is, if you're an applicant for the housing, you actually in Brookline, you get a priority if you're a victim of domestic violence. So even though there is a wait list, and sometimes that might not be an immediate unit available, you jump to the top of the list. And many of the vacancies that we get, and we don't have a lot of vacancies, we fill with victims of domestic violence. So we are a resource to the extent possible for low-income individuals who are experiencing domestic violence. In terms of the vouchers, where does the money come from? There's two sources of money for vouchers. One is the federal government in the Section 8 program, and the other is the state government, which is the Mass Rental Voucher Program, MRVP. And so to the extent that those vouchers are available, we can create priorities that might favor victims of domestic violence because of the urgency of their situation. Sometimes those resources just aren't available. They're given out to people who need them, and there's a high demand for them. And in that case, the person may need to go to a domestic violence shelter.
No room at the end today. Really, there's no room, Susan. And I know it's a for emergencies in Brooklyn, but anyway, go ahead. Yeah,
there's certainly a shortage everywhere, and we have to deal with that in a whole other way, because we only have the resources that we have, and that legislatures have to understand the importance of these kinds of issues, as well as just general issues of we don't have enough affordable housing, period. We don't have enough public housing, period. We need to look at how are those programs funded and convince our legislators to step up to the plate and to provide more funding for all these different programs, but particularly for people who are in urgent need of housing like this. Now, there are some other programs that I've been part of that you might want to hear about that are
Sure.
sort of interesting solutions. I work in Cambridge, have for many, many years. And, we started out, many years ago, let's say 15 years ago, I'm just picking that number out of a hat. And we would often find ourselves kind of in these situations where there was somebody who was a victim of domestic violence, and either they wanted to be admitted or they wanted us to overlook a situation in their household. And they would come in with a representative from domestic violence shelters such as Transition House, which is a wonderful organization in Cambridge. And we would be on the opposite sides of the table. And one day it occurred to us as we were learning as housing authority staff, this is the wrong way to approach this situation. We should be on the same side. So we sat down with Transition House and we worked out a really interesting program with Transition House that has a number of different components to it. One of them is what we call sponsor-based housing. So I was talking to you a couple minutes ago about Section 8 vouchers that we give to individuals. Well, in this case, what we do is we give the vouchers to Transition House, and then Transition House can use the money from those vouchers to pay for services or to pay for housing or any way they want. So it allows them to expand their inventory of available housing, and they get to also utilize the money. They could pay for staff, they could bring in other kinds of services or however. And over the years, that has worked really well, and we've expanded the program. So now Transition House trains our staff. Transition House is available to our residents. If we see somebody who's in need of assistance, and we see that there's a domestic violence component, we have regular access to Transition House. And we've also expanded it so that there's a third party in this, which is the city of Cambridge, which also has an office of to address domestic violence issues. And we have a three-way arrangement that includes us, Transition House, and the city of Cambridge. So it's a very rich environment. Not enough. We're never there for enough. But one of the reasons we could do that is because Cambridge Housing Authority has a lot of flexibility in how it's allowed to use its funding. And that's that Moving to Work program that you mentioned in the introduction.
For a minute, Susan. And we're talking to Susan Cohen, Housing Authority and guru lawyer. Why aren't there, number one, more transition houses in other communities, i.e. Brookline doesn't have a transition house? That's number one. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but if it's such a rich program and it sounds great, it sounds like something we could use here. And now I forgot my second question, so go ahead.
Okay. Well, one of the things about Transition House is they're a longstanding nonprofit organization that has their own funding and their own program. And I cannot answer the question as to why Brookline doesn't have its own transition house. What I can tell you is why Cambridge Housing Authority is able to use its money to support Transition House in a way that right now, while we're looking for ways to do it, Brookline Housing Authority hasn't been able to, but we could follow up on that in a number of ways. But Cambridge Housing Authority was lucky enough to become part of a demonstration program. It's called Moving to Work, but that's really a misnomer, because really what it lets you do as a housing authority is take whatever funds you get from the federal government and put them together in a big pot, and then use the money as you see fit. Usually it's like in silos. So you get this source of money and you could use that for, let's say, maintenance, and you get this pot of money and you could use it to do long-term capital repairs, or you get this bunch of money and you use that to subsidize individual tenants who are living in private housing. But what a Moving to Work agency can do is it can put it all together in one big pot and use it however it wants to. And so what we were able to do in Cambridge is identify a local priority, which was domestic violence. And we were able to work with our partners to create a really rich program that we think is a good model. Now, I would love to see that happen in Brookline, and that's one of
And
the reasons
make
that
it
our
happen in
commissioner.
Brookline? Can
Pardon?
we make it happen in Brookline? Because
Well,
there
we
is
could try. One of the things that the MTW program for many years could not expand because Congress did not authorize it. But in 2016, they said that they would add 100 new agencies. So those agencies have been coming on board. And Brookline Housing Authority applied, and it was done by lottery. And unfortunately, even though we had a fabulous application, we lost the lottery. So we hope that there'll be another round that we can apply for. Right now, there's a prospect for more agencies to get added, but Congress has limited them to very tiny housing authorities, and we're just a little bit too big to qualify. Now, that said, that doesn't mean we can't try to think outside the box. And that's what I'd like to try to do as a commissioner, is think, well, how can we do the kinds of things that we're doing in Cambridge, in Brookline? And we could look at other partners. We could look to the town of Brookline. They've been wonderful in the last number of years. They've provided us with federal funding through ARPA and through our CDBG program and so on.
good. What about looking at hotels? What about looking at possible new development in the MBTA community, requiring developers to set aside a unit, a room, something that can be utilized, number one, in emergency situations, Susan, because we have a number of those in Brookline, or for a family, say, for a year to get their feet on the ground. I mean, I look at the hotels in Brookline post-COVID, empty.
Is that
Even
right?
Marathon, Marriott's across the street. Usually there are cars lined up, traffic's a mess, the little green shuttle, but no, there were a few people, but it wasn't mobbed. So I'm just wondering if anybody's reached out to these, I guess, landlords or these facilities.
Well, I don't think that's happened to my knowledge yet, but I do think there's some examples in other parts of the country where, especially prompted by COVID, there have been a number of motels or hotels that have been converted. And I think there's some examples in the Boston area that I think the Boston Housing Authority may have done some of those conversions. And I think that's a direction that we should definitely pursue. And I do think that that's the kind of example where you need to sort of be putting together like a jigsaw puzzle of resources. No
Yes.
one stream of resources is going to be able to do it because it's expensive. And what you want to do is you want to have a service-rich environment, because just because somebody moves into an apartment doesn't mean that they're going to be in a stable situation in their life. So you need to be able to provide them with the option of providing supportive services that will help them succeed. And that's what we should be doing.
Absolutely. And during COVID, did you see an uptick in domestic violence in the Cambridge housing situation or even in Brookline?
You know, I honestly didn't myself personally notice that. That doesn't mean that it hadn't happened. But you know, I'd say our frontline staff probably would have dealt with that situation. I heard anecdotally that has been a problem, but I can't tell you specifically whether it was particular to public housing or the programs that we operate.
Post-COVID, have you seen an uptick in people in applications as a result of domestic violence to public housing?
Not
Or you
that I'm
don't?
aware of. It could be that that's there, but that hasn't been a problem that's been drawn to my attention. So I would say that there's probably not something that is happening right now.
Susan Cohen, housing attorney, in the last couple of minutes, what would you like our audience to know? What can they do to help in this situation? Help get more affordable housing, help those in situations of domestic violence seek safety.
Well, I think that there's been some really interesting progress lately for the whole community in Brookline to become more conscious of the needs of our public housing residents and our voucher holders. And so I really encourage people to keep tabs on what is going on in town, what is going on with the MBTA Communities Act, and how can we produce more housing, and what is going on with our appropriations through town meeting and our allocations of funds that come from the federal government. So the more that we raise people's awareness of those needs, the more we'll be able to solve these problems. It takes money to solve problems, and they don't go away just because we want them to go away. We could all agree that this is a problem that we want to solve, but we need real resources. So I suggest that anyone who really wants to see this problem solved, show up at public meetings. If you have a town meeting member and there's going to be a vote on something important that relates to this, let them know. There's Zoom meetings for hearings on what we should be doing with our federal funding, with our CDBG money, with other funds that are intended to serve this population. Let's speak out. Let's tell our officials what we need, and I think we'll see a result.
Susan Cohen, thank you so much for sharing your much well-earned experience with us. How do people get in touch with you if they would like to chat with you personally or professionally?
Well, I'll give you my phone number, which is 617-877-5421, and call anytime. And my email address, Susan Carol Cohen, SUSANCAROL @COHEN@gmail.com.
Susan Cohen, thank you again, and we're going to have you back because this is an ever burgeoning problem. I'm sorry to say that. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, Susan, and it's been a pleasure to be with you.
That's it for Safety Net this round. See you all soon when hopefully it'll be a little bit warmer. Bye.
Bye-bye.